Welcome to Focus BC. I'm Richard Zussman here at the BC Legislature. The Premier alongside his cabinet meeting this week with First Nation leaders from across the province. Reconciliation, what that looks like in BC, is chief among the conversation points, but the Cowichan lands decision from the courts was the underlying conversation. I spoke about that and more with Shana Thomas from the First Nation Summit earlier this week.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
So obviously we wrapped up a very busy week in Vancouver. What stood out for you in terms of the conversations you were able to have with government, premier, and ministers, and the general sense of where things are at with the relationship between First Nations in this province and our provincial government?
I think what I found for some communities, it's a different take. Some of the communities found that there was a lot of progress. They felt like they had successful meetings, that they were able to get their points across. Some of the other communities felt that perhaps there was a lot more work to do in terms of the relationship. There's always fear when it comes to the Crown that they may backtrack on things like reconciliation, the implementation of the UN Declaration, engaging in shared decision-making frameworks, talking about governance and stewardship. So many of our communities have ambitious plans. They want to move forward in their territories, and they really were looking to see some solid indications that the Crown was still supportive of those initiatives.
Yeah, First Nations are as diverse as British Columbians are. I think people often underestimate that. But I think the goal towards reconciliation is something that's probably commonly held throughout First Nations. With the rhetoric that we're hearing, and we'll get into some specific topics in a minute, but with the rhetoric we're hearing here in Victoria, is that adding to the concerns about how committed the province is? And I know it's coming from opposition parties, but it does put political pressure on. Is that leading to some of the concerns about how committed this government is to reconciliation?
Absolutely. And I think we can't underestimate the impact of Bills 14 and 15 and how the provincial government chose to implement those. They didn't engage with communities. They didn't honor the way in which they had committed to the implementation of the UN Declaration. We're in the process right now of reviewing provincial legislation to ensure that it aligns with the Declaration. So when that happened, even though communities understand the need to protect the economy and advance jobs for British Columbians, all of us agree with that. It's just the way in which it was approached that kind of caused a bit of concern for communities to say, wait a minute, is this how we're going to be moving forward on a number of initiatives? And if so, what does that mean for our relationship? So I think that specifically did raise some eyebrows in community.
To remind people, those bills gave the province sweeping power around infrastructure and largely bypassed, as you described, the consultation period with First Nations. The other issue, obviously, the province is grappling with now is the Cowichan tribe's decision. A lot of public attention is now being paid to this. I asked you this earlier this week when I saw you in Vancouver. What responsibility is there from the Cowichan, from First Nations to articulate to British Columbians the impact that this court ruling may have on their fee simple, their right to land, their private property rights? Is there an obligation here for First Nation communities in the Cowichan to articulate that to British Columbians?
I found this rhetoric really fascinating because when I read the decision, it's really clear. And to be fair, I'm not a lawyer, but when I read the decision, it was pretty clear to me that the court made it specific that they weren't talking about the individual private landowners. And so this concentration of effort around what this means for individual landowners and kind of this, we called it a bit of fear mongering, was really fascinating. I think British Columbians have a duty to understand that this province is young. This province is, 150 years old, if that. And for our communities, we've been here since time immemorial. I've got artifacts in my village site that date beyond 5,000 years. The name I carried, Cowichan, is a war chief's name that's been passed down from generation to generation. So I really feel that British Columbians need to inform themselves about the colonial frameworks that are operating around them, understand the First Nations communities and the territories that they're on. And in our situation for the Cowichan Nation, which includes Cowichan tribes, Penelakut, Palelt, Chemainus, and Lyackson, particularly the town of Richmond, they had a lawyer on this case for them. So I feel like it was their lawyer's responsibility to have those conversations with the community. And I can assure you that for the Cowichan Nation, how they feel about this and what their vision is, they'll definitely be able to articulate that for themselves. And I think all of our communities can do that. And when there's an opportunity, as you know, it's under appeal and the province is applying for, I can't recall what the fancy word is, but something of
Day.
this, thank you, the stay of application or something to that
Yeah.
effect. We won't really know for sure what our obligations are until we get the sense of where things are going to go in that regard.
One of the things the BC Conservatives are now calling for is, in essence, to pause all current negotiations around treaty with First Nations, to have the province disclose what legal claims are currently being put on land in British Columbia. What do you make of this, in essence, political strategy from the Conservatives?
I think it's fair to say that First Nations people have occupied every square inch of this province prior to contact. So I don't think we need to try to perplex over which parts are in and which parts are not. Let's just start from the base premise that Indigenous people were here, they used and occupied the entirety of their territories, and we now have a province called British Columbia. So that's the starting point. I think it's imperative to enforce treaty negotiations, agreements, and other constructive arrangements with First Nations communities because that's the only way we get to certainty. Our communities want certainty, British Columbians want certainty, and we can't do that by continuing to ignore the inherent rights and title of First Nations. That's how this decision came about because they didn't want to talk about it at the treaty table, even though they now say we should have negotiated this, but we were, and we have been for 30 years. And they really forced the hands of communities to enter into litigation. And that has consequences. And I think we all need to take responsibility for that. So for me and Lyackson, we've been very clear that we are looking for a final agreement. We want a constitutionally protected arrangement. And we've articulated really clearly to the province and to Canada, you know, British Columbia, when you joined Confederation, you signed on to the terms of the Union and you said, this is how we are going to participate in this Confederation. And we as First Nations people, we need to have that same opportunity. And treaties are our terms of the Union. This is how we intend to participate in the Confederation. So I think suggesting that we stop all negotiation is absurd. I think we have to be realistic. We have to understand that the courts in this country have declared that Aboriginal rights exist. Aboriginal title exists. There's an inescapable economic component. And the courts have continually said in Delgamuukw, in Chilcotin, and now in the Cowichan Nation decision, you have to negotiate. You have to negotiate. Even in the New Channel, Aboriginal right to fish was declared. I can't remember the words, but I think it was like a moderate livelihood. They still had to negotiate with DFO. So we know all roads lead to negotiation. So let's get ahead of it. Let's all acknowledge that that's a responsibility that we have, and let's get to concluding these agreements.
Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you.